I never imagined that standing in the gleaming conference room of Peterson and Associates real estate development on a Tuesday morning in March would end with my boss Marcus Peterson screaming at me in front of 12 horrified colleagues, calling me worthless deadweight and threatening to throw me back to whatever trailer park spawned me. Even less could I have anticipated the look of absolute terror on his face 3 hours later when I calmly walked into his corner office and placed an official eviction notice on his mahogany desk, bearing my signature as the new owner of the building that housed his precious company. But that moment of crystalline confrontation, shattering 3 years of systematic workplace abuse and humiliation, became the catalyst that not only reclaimed my dignity, but transformed me from a seemingly powerless assistant into the woman who would own the very ground beneath his feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in my life as senior executive assistant to Marcus Peterson, though I should clarify that the senior part of my title was purely ceremonial, designed to make me feel important while I performed the same menial tasks I'd been doing since the day I started 3 years ago. I arrived at the Peterson and Associates offices at 7:30 sharp, exactly 90 minutes before Marcus typically graced us with his presence, carrying the extra-large coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of cream that he demanded every morning, along with the fresh croissant from the French bakery 6 blocks away that cost more than I spent on lunch for an entire week. The Peterson and Associates building occupied prime real estate in downtown Portland, a gleaming 15-story monument to commercial success with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Columbia River. Marcus had inherited the company from his father, along with what seemed like an unlimited capacity for making other people feel small. His corner office on the 14th floor was a shrine to his own perceived importance, filled with awards he'd bought rather than earned, photographs with politicians whose hands he'd shaken at fundraising events, and expensive furniture that he'd charged to the company as necessary business expenses. I had learned to navigate the marble lobby with the kind of invisible efficiency that Marcus demanded from all support staff. We were expected to anticipate his needs without being asked, solve problems without bothering him with details, and, above all, remain grateful for the privilege of working for Portland's most dynamic real estate development firm. The security guard, an older gentleman named Frank who had worked in the building for over a decade, always greeted me with genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold professionalism that characterized most interactions within Peterson and Associates. "Morning, Sarah," Frank said as I signed in, his weathered face creasing into a familiar smile. "You're here early again. That man's got you running ragged." I managed a tired smile in return, appreciating Frank's consistent kindness, even though I couldn't openly agree with his assessment. "Just staying ahead of the day," I replied diplomatically, though we both knew the truth. Marcus Peterson had conditioned his entire staff to arrive early and stay late, not because the work demanded it, but because he enjoyed the power of controlling our schedules. The elevator ride to the 14th floor gave me a few minutes to mentally prepare for another day of careful navigation through Marcus's unpredictable moods. I had developed an almost supernatural ability to read his temperament from the smallest signals. The way he entered the office, his tone when greeting the receptionist, even the speed of his footsteps down the hallway. This morning would require particular caution because I knew he was still irritated about yesterday's client meeting that hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd expected. My desk sat directly outside Marcus's office, positioned so that I could monitor his door while managing the constant stream of phone calls, emails, and requests that flowed through his office. The space was open concept, which meant that every conversation, every phone call, and every interaction was potentially visible to my colleagues. This visibility had become both a blessing and a curse over the past 3 years. While it meant that my competence was obvious to everyone who worked with me, it also meant that Marcus's treatment of me was equally visible. I began my morning routine with methodical precision, reviewing Marcus's calendar for any changes or additions that might have come in overnight, checking his email for urgent messages that would need immediate attention, and preparing briefing materials for his first meeting at 10. The Peterson and Associates client list included some of Portland's most prestigious commercial developments, and Marcus never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that his personal relationships with these clients were the foundation of the company's success. What Marcus consistently failed to acknowledge was how much of that success actually depended on the behind-the-scenes work performed by his support staff. I had spent 3 years learning the intricate details of every major project, developing relationships with contractors and suppliers, and solving problems that Marcus never even knew existed. My title might have been Senior Executive Assistant, but my actual responsibilities encompassed project coordination, client relationship management, and crisis resolution far beyond anything typically associated with administrative support. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Marcus took credit for the smooth operation of his business, he also seemed to view my competence as a personal threat rather than an asset. Any suggestion I made was either ignored or presented later as his own idea. Any problem I solved without bothering him was evidence that I wasn't keeping him properly informed. Any recognition I received from clients or colleagues was quickly redirected to emphasize his leadership and vision. At 8:45, I heard the distinctive sound of Marcus's BMW pulling into his reserved parking space directly outside the building. He drove a silver convertible that he'd purchased with company funds, justifying it as necessary for maintaining the proper image when meeting with high-profile clients. The car was immaculate, detailed weekly at company expense, and served as a rolling advertisement for his personal brand of success. Marcus entered the office with his usual theatrical flair, sweeping through the lobby in his perfectly tailored Italian suit, his salt and pepper hair styled to suggest distinguished authority rather than his actual age of 52. He had cultivated an image of effortless sophistication that relied heavily on expensive accessories and carefully managed appearances. The gold watch on his wrist cost more than I earned in 6 months, and he made sure everyone noticed it. "Sarah," he called as he approached my desk, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need the Morrison project files immediately. The entire portfolio, not just the summary documents you usually prepare." I had anticipated this request based on his calendar and had already prepared the comprehensive Morrison materials, including the detailed financial projections and environmental impact assessments that he typically ignored until the last possible moment. "Everything's ready," I said, standing to hand him the organized files. "I've also included the updated cost estimates from the engineering firm and the revised timeline from the construction manager." Instead of acknowledging my preparation, Marcus flipped through the materials with practiced dismissiveness. "These numbers don't match what I discussed with Morrison yesterday," he said, though I knew he hadn't spoken with Morrison in over a week. "You'll need to verify everything and have corrected versions ready before the 10 o'clock meeting." This was a familiar pattern. Marcus would create artificial urgency around tasks that had already been completed correctly, then position himself as the responsible party who caught potential errors before they became problems. I had learned not to argue with his version of events, even when they directly contradicted documented facts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'll review everything immediately," I replied, though I knew the files were accurate because I had triple-checked them the previous afternoon. "Would you like me to call Morrison's office to confirm the specific figures you discussed?" Marcus's expression sharpened at my suggestion, and I immediately recognized my mistake. By offering to verify his supposed conversation with Morrison, I had inadvertently highlighted the fact that no such conversation had actually occurred. This kind of logical problem-solving, which should have been valued in any functional workplace, was perceived by Marcus as a challenge to his authority. "That won't be necessary," he said coldly. "Just focus on doing your job correctly the first time." He disappeared into his office, leaving me to perform the pointless exercise of re-verifying information that was already accurate. This wasn't about the Morrison project files, or even about maintaining quality standards. It was about reinforcing the power dynamic that kept me constantly off balance, always questioning my own competence, and perpetually grateful for his patience with my supposed inadequacies. As I methodically reviewed the Morrison materials for the fourth time in 24 hours, I reflected on how gradually I had accepted this pattern of interaction as normal. When I first started working for Peterson and Associates, I had attributed Marcus's demanding nature to his high standards and commitment to excellence. I had told myself that his occasional harsh criticism was simply the price of working for a successful businessman who expected the best from his team. Over time, however, I had begun to recognize that Marcus's behavior wasn't actually about maintaining quality or achieving better results. His demands were arbitrary. His timelines were designed to create stress rather than meet genuine deadlines. And his criticism was personal rather than constructive. He seemed to derive satisfaction from creating situations where I would struggle to meet impossible expectations, then positioning himself as the reasonable authority figure who graciously tolerated my limitations. The Morrison project itself was a perfect example of this dynamic. I had been managing the administrative aspects of the development for over 18 months, coordinating between architects, contractors, city planning officials, and environmental consultants. I knew every detail of the project timeline, every potential complication, and every key decision point. Marcus, meanwhile, attended occasional high-level meetings where he presented information I had prepared and took credit for, solutions I had developed. Yet whenever problems arose or adjustments were needed, Marcus consistently treated me as though I was a recent hire who couldn't be trusted with basic responsibilities. He would demand detailed explanations of situations I had already briefed him on, question decisions that had been made collaboratively weeks earlier, and express concern about my ability to handle the complexity of the project. At 9:30, approximately 1 hour before the Morrison meeting was scheduled to begin, Marcus emerged from his office with an expression that I had learned to recognize as dangerous. His jaw was set in the particular way that indicated he was preparing to create a crisis that would somehow become my responsibility to resolve. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying the kind of false calm that preceded his most unreasonable demands. "I need you to cancel the Morrison meeting and reschedule it for this afternoon. Something's come up that requires immediate attention." I glanced at my computer screen, where Morrison's calendar was displayed alongside the calendars of the 3 other participants who were planning to attend the meeting. Morrison was flying in from Seattle specifically for this meeting, having rearranged his own schedule to accommodate Marcus's original timing request. The other attendees included the project architect and the primary contractor, both of whom had adjusted their Tuesday morning schedules around this commitment. "I can certainly reach out to everyone," I said carefully, "but Morrison mentioned yesterday that he has a flight back to Seattle at 3 o'clock. He specifically chose the morning meeting to accommodate his travel schedule." Marcus's expression darkened immediately. "Are you questioning my decision?" "Not at all," I replied quickly, recognizing the warning signs. "I just wanted to make sure you had all the relevant information before I contact everyone. Would you prefer that I try to reach Morrison first to see if he has any flexibility in his departure time?" "I would prefer that you follow instructions without analyzing every decision I make," Marcus snapped. "Cancel the meeting, reschedule it for 2 o'clock this afternoon, and figure out how to make it work with everyone's schedules. That's what I pay you to do." The mathematical impossibility of accommodating Morrison's 3 o'clock flight with a 2 o'clock meeting start time was obvious, but pointing this out would only escalate Marcus's irritation. I had learned that in situations like this, the best strategy was to attempt the impossible task he had assigned, document the predictable complications that arose, and then present him with options that would allow him to make a different decision, while maintaining the illusion that he had been in control all along. I spent the next 20 minutes making a series of increasingly awkward phone calls to reschedule a meeting that couldn't realistically be rescheduled. Morrison's assistant was politely bewildered by the request, noting that her boss was already en route to Portland and wouldn't be able to stay past 3 o'clock under any circumstances. The architect had back-to-back client meetings all afternoon and couldn't adjust his schedule on 3 hours' notice. The contractor was scheduled to be at a construction site across town at 2 o'clock for a concrete pour that couldn't be delayed. Each conversation reinforced what I had known from the beginning. Marcus's rescheduling demand was logistically impossible. Yet I continued making the calls because refusing to attempt the task would have been characterized as insubordination, while attempting it and failing would be characterized as incompetence. Either way, I would be blamed for the negative outcome, but at least by making the effort, I could demonstrate that the failure wasn't due to lack of diligence on my part. At 10:15, Marcus emerged from his office again, this time with the expression of someone who was genuinely surprised that his impossible demand hadn't been successfully executed. "Where's Morrison?" he asked, looking around the reception area as though he expected to find the client waiting patiently despite the meeting cancellation. "I was able to reach Morrison's assistant," I explained calmly. "Unfortunately, he's already committed to his 3 o'clock flight, so the 2 o'clock meeting time won't work with his schedule. The architect and contractor also have conflicts with the afternoon timing. I have a few alternative suggestions if you'd like to hear them." Instead of asking about the alternatives I had prepared, Marcus's face flushed with the particular shade of red that indicated he was transitioning from irritation to genuine anger. "You're telling me that you couldn't manage to schedule a simple meeting with 4 people?" "I was able to confirm that the original 10 o'clock meeting time still works for everyone," I replied, maintaining professional composure despite the growing absurdity of the situation. "Morrison is actually in the building right now, waiting in the lobby. If you'd like to proceed with the original schedule, I can have everyone here in 5 minutes." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through several emotions that I couldn't quite identify. Later, I would realize that this was the moment when he made the conscious decision to create a public spectacle that would serve as an example to the rest of the staff about the consequences of challenging his authority, even indirectly. "Conference room," he said finally. "Now, and bring all the Morrison files." I gathered the materials I had prepared earlier, including the comprehensive project portfolio that Marcus had originally requested, and the updated financial projections that I had unnecessarily verified at his demand. The conference room was located in the center of the 14th floor, surrounded by glass walls that provided visibility from most of the office space. It was Marcus's preferred venue for important meetings because it allowed him to display his authority while ensuring that his interactions with clients and colleagues were visible to the entire staff. As I arranged the materials on the polished conference table, I noticed that several of my colleagues had positioned themselves at their desks in ways that would allow them to observe the meeting without appearing to actively watch. This was a common phenomenon during Marcus's more dramatic performances. Everyone had learned to pay attention when he was clearly building toward one of his explosive moments. Morrison arrived precisely on time, accompanied by the architect and contractor who had managed to adjust their schedules to accommodate the original meeting time. Morrison was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who had built a successful development company through decades of careful relationship management and ethical business practices. His reputation in Portland's commercial real estate community was impeccable, which made his ongoing partnership with Peterson and Associates somewhat puzzling to those of us who observed Marcus's behavior on a daily basis. "Marcus," Morrison said warmly as he entered the conference room, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "Good to see you. I understand there was some confusion about the timing this morning." Marcus's response was a masterclass in deflection and blame redistribution. "Unfortunately, my assistant struggled with some basic scheduling coordination," he said, gesturing dismissively in my direction. "But we're here now, and that's what matters." I felt my face flush at the casual inaccuracy of his characterization, But I maintained my professional expression and focused on ensuring that everyone had the materials they needed for the discussion. This was another familiar pattern. Marcus would create problems, then publicly blame me for the complications that resulted from his own decisions. The meeting proceeded normally for approximately 30 minutes, with Morrison and the other participants reviewing the project timeline and discussing minor adjustments to the construction schedule. I took detailed notes, prepared to address any questions that might arise, and maintained the careful invisibility that Marcus expected from support staff during client meetings. Then Morrison asked a question that changed everything. "Marcus, I've been impressed with the quality of project coordination throughout this development," Morrison said, flipping through his copy of the materials I had prepared. "Sarah's attention to detail and proactive communication have been exceptional. I'm curious about her background. Has she considered pursuing project management certification? With her skill set, she'd be a valuable addition to your development team." The silence that followed Morrison's comment was thick with tension that only I seemed to fully appreciate. Marcus's carefully constructed narrative about my incompetence had just been directly contradicted by the client who was supposed to be impressed with Marcus's personal management of the project. Morrison's recognition of my contributions undermined the power dynamic that Marcus had spent 3 years establishing. "Sarah is an administrative assistant," Marcus replied stiffly. "Her role is to support the actual project management, not to participate in strategic decision-making." Morrison looked genuinely surprised by this response. "Administrative assistant? I assumed she was your project coordinator based on our interactions. Every time I've called with questions or concerns, she's had immediate access to detailed information and has been able to make decisions about scheduling changes and vendor coordination." My heart began racing as I realized what was happening. Morrison's innocent comments were exposing the gap between Marcus's public claims about my role and the actual responsibilities I had been performing. For 3 years, I had been doing project management work while being classified and compensated as an assistant. More importantly, I had been directly interfacing with clients who naturally assumed I had the authority that my expertise suggested. Marcus's face was now visibly flushed, and I could see him struggling to formulate a response that would maintain his authority without directly contradicting Morrison's observations. The architect and contractor were listening to this exchange with obvious interest, probably recognizing similar patterns from their own interactions with our office. "Sarah handles routine coordination tasks under my direct supervision," Marcus said, his voice tighter than usual. "Any decisions she appears to make independently are actually implementing specific instructions I've provided." This was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, not just because Marcus was misrepresenting my role, but because he was doing so in a way that made Morrison look foolish for having attributed decision-making authority to me. I could see Morrison's expression shifting from friendly confusion to something that looked like concern about the dynamics he was witnessing. "I see," Morrison said slowly. "Well, regardless of the formal reporting structure, the coordination has been excellent. That's what matters for the project's success." Marcus seemed to interpret Morrison's diplomatic response as an opportunity to reassert control over the narrative. "Coordination is important," he agreed, "but it's crucial to maintain clear boundaries about who has actual authority to make binding decisions. Clients need to know they're working with qualified professionals, not support staff who might exceed their competence." The insult was delivered with Marcus's characteristic blend of apparent reasonableness and subtle cruelty. He had managed to diminish my contributions while questioning my qualifications, all while maintaining the pretense of explaining appropriate business protocols to Morrison. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Morrison was no longer nodding along with Marcus's explanations. The architect was looking uncomfortable. The contractor was studying his notes with the focused attention of someone who was trying to avoid witnessing an awkward situation. "Marcus," Morrison said carefully, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about the level of expertise Sarah has demonstrated in our project coordination. The decisions she's made have been consistently sound, and her understanding of The development timeline has been more detailed than what I typically see from administrative support. Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. Morrison's continued defense of my competence was undermining his authority in exactly the kind of public forum where Marcus most needed to maintain control. I could see him making the calculation that would lead to the explosion I had been dreading since the morning began. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "I appreciate your feedback about our service delivery. However, I think it's important for you to understand the actual structure of our organization and the appropriate channels for project communication." He turned to look directly at me, and I recognized the expression that preceded his most devastating personal attacks. "Sarah's enthusiasm sometimes leads her to overstep her defined role," he continued, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. "While she means well, it's crucial that clients understand the difference between actual project management and administrative support that's designed to make things run smoothly behind the scenes." The room had become completely silent. Morrison was staring at Marcus with undisguised surprise, clearly recognizing that he was witnessing something inappropriate but not quite sure how to respond. The architect and contractor were now openly uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs and avoiding eye contact with everyone else at the table. I felt a familiar mixture of humiliation and rage building in my chest. This was the moment I had experienced dozens of times before. Marcus would publicly diminish my contributions, question my competence, and re-establish his authority by making me look foolish in front of witnesses. The pattern was so established that I usually knew exactly how to respond, maintaining professional composure while internally absorbing the insult and planning to address any resulting client confusion privately later. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Morrison's genuine recognition of my work, or the obvious discomfort of the other meeting participants, or simply the accumulation of 3 years' worth of similar humiliations finally reaching a breaking point. Instead of accepting Marcus's characterization and moving forward with the meeting, I found myself making a choice that would change everything. "Actually," I said, my voice calmer than I expected, "I think there might be some confusion about my qualifications and responsibilities that would be helpful to clarify." The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, probably because I had never directly contradicted his version of events in front of a client before. Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest, apparently relieved that someone was going to address the awkward dynamics he had been witnessing. "I have a master's degree in business administration with a concentration in project management," I continued, maintaining eye contact with Morrison while remaining aware of Marcus's increasingly dangerous expression. "I've been coordinating all aspects of the Morrison project for the past 18 months, including vendor relationships, timeline management, and problem resolution. The decisions Mr. Morrison has experienced weren't implementations of Marcus's instructions. They were independent assessments based on my direct knowledge of project requirements and constraints." The silence that followed my statement was deafening. I had just publicly contradicted Marcus's characterization of my role, my qualifications, and my decision-making authority in front of the client who represented one of Peterson and Associates' most important ongoing relationships. From Marcus's perspective, I had committed an act of insubordination so serious that it threatened the fundamental power structure of his organization. Morrison's expression had shifted to something approaching amazement. "You have an MBA in project management?" he asked. "And you've been working as an administrative assistant for 3 years?" "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice sharp with barely controlled fury. "Sarah, I think you've misunderstood your role here significantly. Mr. Morrison, I apologize for this confusion. We'll continue this meeting without further interruption." But Morrison wasn't finished with his questions. "Marcus, I'm genuinely confused about this situation. If Sarah has project management qualifications and has been successfully coordinating our development for over a year, why is she classified as administrative support? And why are you characterizing her work as exceeding her defined role, rather than recognizing it as exactly the kind of expertise I've been paying for? Marcus's face had progressed from red to an alarming shade of purple. The question Morrison was asking touched the heart of everything that was wrong with the power dynamic at Peterson and Associates. I had been performing professional-level work, while being classified, compensated, and treated as support staff. More damaging to Marcus, I had been building direct relationships with clients who valued my expertise without his knowledge or approval. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, standing abruptly from his chair, "I think we need to reschedule this meeting so that I can address some internal personnel issues that are clearly affecting our service delivery." Morrison remained seated, looking between Marcus and me with an expression of growing concern. "Actually, Marcus, I think I'd prefer to continue our discussion. Sarah, would you mind walking me through the current project timeline? I have some questions about the next phase that require detailed coordination knowledge." This was the moment when everything crystallized. Morrison was explicitly requesting that I continue in the role Marcus had just finished denying I was qualified to perform. More than that, he was doing so in front of witnesses after Marcus had publicly questioned my competence and authority. Marcus's response was swift and devastating. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice rising to a level that was audible throughout the open office space. "Mr. Morrison, I will not allow my administrative assistant to misrepresent her qualifications or authority to my clients. Sarah, you are completely out of line, and this behavior is exactly why you'll never be more than support staff in this organization." He turned to face me directly, his expression twisted with rage and something that looked like genuine hatred. "You are worthless deadweight who apparently doesn't understand the difference between answering phones and managing multi-million-dollar developments. Your job is to take notes, schedule meetings, and stay quiet unless someone specifically asks you a direct question. If you can't perform those basic functions without fantasizing about being qualified for work that's completely beyond your capabilities, then maybe this isn't the right position for you." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to humiliate and diminish. But Marcus wasn't finished with his public destruction of my character and competence. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice now loud enough to be heard clearly throughout the 14th floor, "your constant overstepping and inappropriate communication with clients has been a problem for months. I've been patient with your delusions about your importance to this organization, but apparently, I need to be more direct about your actual value to this company." He moved closer to my chair, looming over me in a way that felt physically intimidating. "You are easily replaceable. Administrative support. Nothing more. Your opinions about project management are irrelevant. Your suggestions about business operations are unwelcome, and your attempts to build independent relationships with our clients are completely inappropriate." The conference room had become completely silent except for Marcus's voice, which continued to rise as he fed off his own momentum. Through the glass walls, I could see that the entire office staff had stopped working to watch this public evisceration. Some looked shocked, others appeared uncomfortable, but no one was making any move to intervene. "I should have addressed this problem earlier," Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to Morrison's horrified expression and the obvious discomfort of the other meeting participants. "You've been allowed to develop an inflated sense of your own importance that's completely disconnected from reality. Well, let me clarify your reality, Sarah. You are a secretary with delusions of grandeur, but still just a secretary. Your job is to serve coffee, answer phones, and be grateful for the opportunity to work for a company that's successful enough to afford even basic administrative support." The words trailer park that would come next were already forming on his lips when Morrison finally found his voice. "Marcus," Morrison said, standing from his chair with obvious authority, "I think this meeting needs to end immediately." But Marcus was beyond reason now, completely consumed by his need to publicly destroy any perception that I might have legitimate professional qualifications or decision-making authority. This is exactly the kind of reality check she's needed for 3 years, Marcus snarled, turning back toward Morrison. Sarah apparently thinks that being able to follow basic instructions qualifies her for actual professional responsibility. Maybe she should go back to whatever trailer park spawned her and find work that matches her actual capabilities. The trailer park comment landed like a physical blow, not just because of its cruelty, but because it revealed the depth of Marcus's contempt for anyone he perceived as beneath his social and economic status. The comment was designed to humiliate me, not just professionally, but personally, attacking my background and family circumstances that he had never bothered to learn anything about. Morrison was standing now, his face flushed with obvious anger. "Marcus, this is completely unacceptable. I will not be party to this kind of treatment of your employees." The architect and contractor were gathering their materials, clearly eager to escape a situation that had become unbearably uncomfortable. Through the glass walls, I could see that the entire office was watching in stunned silence, witnessing a level of verbal abuse that crossed every line of professional conduct. But in that moment of absolute humiliation, something unexpected happened. Instead of the familiar rush of shame and self-doubt that usually followed Marcus's attacks, I felt a strange sense of clarity and calm descending over me. Maybe it was the presence of witnesses who could see his behavior for what it really was. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that nothing I could do or say would ever be enough to satisfy his need to maintain power through the systematic destruction of other people's confidence. For the first time in 3 years, I found myself completely unafraid of Marcus Peterson's anger. "Thank you for clarifying your perspective," I said quietly, standing from my chair and gathering my materials with deliberate calm. "I think this has been very instructive for everyone involved." Marcus stared at me, apparently surprised that I wasn't crying or apologizing or begging for another chance to prove myself worthy of his continued employment. Morrison was watching with obvious concern, probably wondering whether he should intervene further or simply distance himself from the toxic dynamics he had witnessed. "I'll need a few minutes to organize some materials," I continued, maintaining the same calm tone despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Then I'd like to speak with you privately in your office, Marcus. There are some documents that require your immediate attention." The transformation in Marcus's expression, from rage to confusion, was immediate and visible. He had expected me to crumble under his assault, to accept his characterization of my worthlessness, and to retreat into the submissive compliance that he had been conditioning for 3 years. Instead, I was speaking with the kind of professional composure that suggested I had access to resources and options he hadn't anticipated. "Documents?" Marcus repeated, his voice uncertain for the first time in the entire exchange. "Yes," I replied, offering Morrison a professional smile. "Mr. Morrison, I apologize for the disruption to your schedule. I'm confident that your project coordination needs will be addressed appropriately moving forward." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression indicating that he understood there were layers to this situation that hadn't been fully revealed. "Sarah, I want you to know that your work on our project has been exceptional, regardless of your official title or classification." "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. "Your recognition of professional competence means more than you know." As the meeting participants filed out of the conference room, leaving Marcus and me alone behind the glass walls that had provided an audience for my public humiliation, I felt a surge of anticipation that surprised me with its intensity. For 3 years, I had absorbed Marcus's abuse while believing that I had no alternatives, no power to change the dynamic, and no resources beyond his willingness to employ me. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in the office knew, was that I had been preparing for this moment far longer than even I had fully realized. The documents waiting in my desk drawer would transform his world just as completely as his words had attempted to transform mine. But unlike his methods, my approach would be based on documented facts, legal authority, and the kind of careful preparation that he had consistently dismissed as the work of worthless deadweight. In 3 hours, Marcus Peterson would discover that the woman he had just publicly humiliated owned the building beneath his feet. And I was about to give him exactly 30 days to find somewhere else to conduct his business. The walk back to my desk felt like crossing a vast expanse of hostile territory, though in reality it was only 20 feet through the open office space where my colleagues sat frozen at their workstations, pretending to focus on their computer screens while stealing glances at the aftermath of Marcus's explosive performance. The silence was so complete that I could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of traffic from the street 14 floors below. Every person in that office had witnessed my public humiliation, and I could feel their mixture of sympathy, embarrassment, and relief that they hadn't been the target of Marcus's rage. Jennifer Walsh, the accounting manager who sat 3 desks away from mine, caught my eye as I passed her workstation. Her expression conveyed the kind of horrified sympathy that comes from watching someone experience something genuinely awful while being powerless to intervene. Jennifer had worked at Peterson & Associates for 7 years, long enough to witness several of Marcus's explosive episodes directed at various employees, but even she seemed shaken by the intensity and personal nature of the attack I had just endured. "Are you okay?" she mouthed silently, her concern genuine and immediate. I managed what I hoped looked like a reassuring nod, though I could feel my hands trembling slightly as I sat down at my desk and reached for the bottom drawer where I kept my personal files. The trembling wasn't from fear or embarrassment, as my colleagues probably assumed. It was from anticipation mixed with a kind of electric energy that comes from finally being ready to act after years of careful preparation. The bottom drawer of my desk contained what appeared to be ordinary personal items: a small photo of my late grandmother, a package of tissues, some over-the-counter pain medication, and a manila folder labeled personal documents that most people would assume contained insurance paperwork or tax records. What the folder actually contained were copies of legal documents, financial records, and correspondence that represented 3 years of methodical preparation for exactly this kind of moment. As I opened the folder and reviewed the materials, inside, I reflected on how I had arrived at this point, not just in terms of the morning's confrontation with Marcus, but in terms of the broader strategy that had been developing since almost the first week of my employment at Peterson & Associates. What my colleagues and Marcus himself had interpreted as patient acceptance of inappropriate treatment had actually been something quite different. A deliberate information-gathering operation designed to document patterns of behavior while building resources that would eventually provide me with alternatives to continued tolerance of his abuse. The process had begun innocently enough. During my first month at Peterson & Associates, I had noticed discrepancies between the work I was actually performing and the job description that had been used to hire me. My official title was Senior Executive Assistant, and my salary reflected that classification, but my actual responsibilities included project coordination, client relationship management, and problem-solving that went far beyond traditional administrative support. Initially, I had attributed this to the natural evolution of workplace roles and had been grateful for the opportunity to apply my MBA training in a practical setting. Over time, however, I had begun to recognize that the gap between my classification and my actual contributions wasn't accidental. Marcus systematically relied on my professional-level work while maintaining the fiction that I was providing only basic administrative support. This allowed him to take credit for my contributions while avoiding the compensation and recognition that should have accompanied my actual role in the organization. More troubling than the misclassification was Marcus's pattern of undermining my confidence and questioning my competence whenever I demonstrated independent judgment or received recognition from clients or colleagues. I had initially interpreted this as perfectionism or high standards, but gradually I began to understand that Marcus felt threatened by evidence of my professional capabilities. His treatment of me wasn't designed to improve my performance or protect the company's interests. It was designed to maintain a power dynamic that kept me dependent on his approval. while preventing me from recognizing my own value in the marketplace. The turning point in my understanding had come approximately 18 months into my employment, during a particularly difficult period when Marcus had been unusually aggressive in his criticism of my work. I had been struggling with self-doubt and questioning whether I was truly suited for professional-level responsibilities when I happened to overhear a conversation between Marcus and Howard Chen, the senior partner at a competing real estate development firm. Howard had called Marcus to express interest in hiring me away from Peterson and Associates, having been impressed with my work during a joint project coordination meeting. Marcus's response had been revealing in ways he probably never intended. Rather than defending my value to his organization or expressing concern about losing a capable employee, Marcus had laughed dismissively and assured Howard that I was just an overqualified secretary who doesn't understand her limitations and that any competent administrative assistant could do the same work for half the salary. But then Marcus had spent another 10 minutes detailing my specific contributions to recent projects, my relationships with key contractors and suppliers, and my ability to solve complex logistical problems without requiring his direct involvement. He had concluded the conversation by telling Howard that Sarah's replacement would need at least 6 months of training to handle the client relationships she's developed, and finding someone with her technical background willing to work for administrative wages would be nearly impossible in today's market. That conversation had crystallized my understanding of the real dynamic at Peterson and Associates. Marcus was fully aware of my professional qualifications and the value of my contributions to his business. His treatment of me wasn't based on genuine concerns about my competence or performance. It was a calculated strategy to maintain access to professional-level work while avoiding the costs and status implications of acknowledging my actual role in the organization. From that point forward, I had begun documenting everything. Every instance of Marcus taking credit for my work, every occasion when he undermined my authority with clients or colleagues, every example of him assigning me responsibilities that exceeded my official job description while maintaining that I was just administrative support. I had saved emails, recorded dates and details of conversations, and maintained careful records of my actual contributions to each project I was assigned to coordinate. More importantly, I had begun developing contingency plans for the inevitable moment when Marcus's treatment of me would become unsustainable. I had quietly begun building relationships with clients and industry contacts who knew the quality of my work regardless of my official title. I had researched my rights as an employee and the legal implications of the various ways Marcus was misrepresenting both my role and my qualifications. And I had begun exploring opportunities that would allow me to use my skills and experience in environments where professional competence was valued rather than threatening. But the most significant element of my preparation had been financial, and it was this aspect of my planning that Marcus and my colleagues knew nothing about. My grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had been an extraordinary woman who had immigrated to Portland from Mexico in 1952 with nothing but determination and an unshakable belief in the importance of owning property. She had worked as a seamstress, a house cleaner, and eventually as a small business owner, saving every possible dollar and investing in real estate throughout Portland's urban core during the 1960s and 1970s, when prices were still accessible to working-class immigrants. By the time of her death 3 years ago, just 2 months before I started working at Peterson and Associates, my grandmother had accumulated a portfolio of properties throughout downtown Portland that had appreciated dramatically as the city's commercial district expanded and gentrified. She had left everything to me, her only grandchild, along with a letter that I still carried in my wallet explaining her philosophy about property ownership as the foundation of true independence. "Property gives you choices, mija," she had written, in her careful handwriting. "When you own the ground beneath other people's feet, you cannot be pushed around by those who think they are more important than you. Use this gift to build a life where you bow to no one who does not deserve your respect." The Peterson and Associates building had been part of my grandmother's portfolio for over 20 years. She had purchased it in 1998 from a developer who was struggling with financing, and she had rented it to various commercial tenants ever since. When Peterson and Associates had signed their lease 5 years ago, my grandmother had been delighted to have such a prestigious tenant, though she had always maintained some reservations about Marcus Peterson himself based on their limited interactions. During lease negotiations, after her death, I had inherited not just the building, but also the existing lease agreements and the responsibility for managing the property. The current lease with Peterson and Associates was set to expire at the end of this year, and Marcus had been negotiating with what he assumed was my grandmother's estate for renewal terms. What he didn't know was that I was the estate, and that I had been quietly observing his negotiations while documenting his attempts to pressure what he believed was an elderly property manager into accepting below-market rental rates. The irony of working for a man who was trying to manipulate my inherited property while simultaneously abusing me as an employee had not been lost on me. For the past year, I had been in the unique position of observing Marcus's business practices from multiple perspectives. As his exploited employee, as his landlord, and as someone with comprehensive knowledge of both his financial situation and his operational dependencies. This morning's confrontation had simply accelerated a timeline I had been considering for several months. The lease renewal negotiations had stalled because Marcus had been demanding rental rates that were substantially below market value, while threatening to relocate Peterson and Associates if his terms weren't accepted. He had been operating under the assumption that an elderly widow's estate would be motivated primarily by security rather than maximizing revenue, and he had become increasingly aggressive in his demands as the lease expiration date approached. What Marcus didn't realize was that his below-market lease payments had been artificially subsidizing his company's profitability for years. The Peterson and Associates operating budget was built around rental costs that were approximately 30% below what comparable downtown office space typically commanded. If he were forced to relocate to market-rate space, his overhead would increase substantially, potentially threatening the financial stability of his entire operation. As I reviewed the documents in my personal folder, I considered the various options available to me. The most straightforward approach would be to simply decline to renew the Peterson and Associates lease and allow Marcus to discover his landlord's identity when he received official notice that his tenancy would be terminated at the end of the year. This would give him several months to find alternative space and would avoid any appearance of retaliation for this morning's confrontation. However, the lease agreement contained several clauses that Marcus had apparently forgotten about or never fully understood. One of these clauses provided for immediate termination of the tenancy in the event of conduct detrimental to the professional reputation of the building or its tenants. Another clause required 30 days' notice for termination due to violation of lease terms, but only if the violation was correctable. Conduct-based terminations could be implemented immediately. This morning's screaming episode, which had been visible and audible to other tenants throughout the building, could arguably constitute conduct detrimental to the professional reputation of the property. More importantly, Marcus's pattern of abusive behavior toward employees, his fraudulent misrepresentation of my qualifications to clients, and his attempts to pressure what he believed was an elderly property manager into accepting below-market lease terms could all be documented as violations of the lease's professional conduct requirements. But beyond the legal technicalities, I found myself considering what my grandmother would have done in this situation. Elena Rodriguez had never tolerated disrespect from anyone, regardless of their social status or economic position. She had faced discrimination, exploitation, and condescension throughout her life, and she had consistently responded by demonstrating that underestimating her was a serious mistake. The folder in my desk drawer contained more than just property documents and lease agreements. It also contained detailed financial analysis of Peterson and Associates' business operations, compiled from information I had access to through my role in project coordination and client management. Marcus had no idea how much I knew about his company's actual financial position, its client dependencies, and its operational vulnerabilities. Peterson and Associates was not the thriving success that Marcus portrayed in his public presentations and marketing materials. The company had been struggling with cash flow problems for over 18 months, partly due to several projects that had gone over budget, and partly due to Marcus's expensive personal lifestyle that was funded through company resources. The below-market lease on the downtown building was one of the few factors keeping the business profitable, and losing access to that space would create financial pressures that Marcus was not prepared to handle. More significantly, several of Peterson and Associates' most important client relationships were actually my relationships, built through the project coordination work that Marcus had assigned to me while maintaining that I was just administrative support. Clients like Morrison had developed confidence in the company's service delivery based on their interactions with me, not with Marcus. If I were no longer available to provide that level of coordination and problem-solving, Peterson and Associates would struggle to maintain the service quality that justified their premium pricing. As I sat at my desk, surrounded by colleagues who were still processing the morning's dramatic confrontation, I realized that I had a choice to make about how to respond to Marcus's public humiliation. I could take the conservative approach, finishing out my employment while quietly declining to renew the building lease and allowing Marcus to discover the consequences of his behavior gradually over the coming months. Or I could take the more direct approach that my grandmother would have favored, demonstrating immediately and decisively that his treatment of me had been a serious miscalculation. The decision crystallized as I remembered the specific words Marcus had used during his tirade. Worthless deadweight and trailer park weren't just professional insults. They were personal attacks designed to humiliate me based on assumptions about my background and social status. Marcus had revealed his fundamental contempt not just for me as an individual, but for anyone he perceived as beneath his economic and social position. My grandmother had spent her entire adult life proving that people who made such assumptions were dangerous fools who deserved whatever consequences their prejudices brought upon them. I opened my computer and began composing the letter that would change Marcus Peterson's world just as completely as his words had attempted to change mine. The eviction notice was a standard legal document that I had prepared weeks earlier with the assistance of my property management attorney, Michael Torres, who had been handling my grandmother's real estate portfolio since before my inheritance. Michael had advised me to have the termination paperwork ready well in advance of any potential need, given Marcus's increasingly difficult behavior during lease negotiations and his pattern of making threats about relocating his business if his demands weren't met. The notice was professionally written, legally precise, and devastating in its implications. It informed Peterson and Associates that their lease was being terminated immediately due to violations of professional conduct clauses, effective in 30 days. It detailed the specific incidents that constituted grounds for termination, including verbal abuse of building occupants, conduct detrimental to professional reputation, and intimidation tactics directed toward property management. What made the notice particularly effective was its complete objectivity. Rather than expressing anger or personal grievance, it simply documented facts and cited specific lease provisions that had been violated. The tone was businesslike and final, offering no opportunity for negotiation or appeal. Peterson and Associates would have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises, and any attempt to remain beyond that deadline would result in formal eviction proceedings. As I printed the notice on letterhead that bore my name as property owner, I felt a strange sense of completion. For 3 years, I had absorbed Marcus's abuse while he remained completely unaware that he was attacking someone who held the power to destroy his business with a single signature. The power dynamic that he had worked so hard to maintain through intimidation and humiliation was about to be revealed as an elaborate illusion. I sealed the notice in an envelope marked Urgent Property Owner Communication and walked toward Marcus's corner office, passing the same colleagues who had witnessed my public humiliation less than an hour earlier. This time, however, I moved with the confidence of someone who was about to fundamentally alter the balance of power in the office. Marcus was on the phone when I knocked on his door, apparently attempting to repair whatever damage had been done to his relationship with Morrison. Through the glass, I could see him gesturing animatedly while speaking in the artificially calm tone he used when trying to convince people that his previous behavior had been misunderstood or taken out of context. "Come in," he called without looking up from his call, probably assuming I was there to apologize or beg for another chance to prove my worth as an employee. I entered his office and stood quietly near his desk, waiting for him to finish his conversation. The space was exactly as pretentious as I had always found it, filled with expensive furniture and meaningless awards that were supposed to convey success and authority. The wall behind his desk featured a large photograph of Marcus shaking hands with the mayor at some ribbon-cutting ceremony, surrounded by smaller photos of him at various business and social events. What Marcus didn't know was that I had been in this office hundreds of times over the past 3 years, not just as his assistant, but as the building owner conducting property inspections and maintenance oversight. I knew exactly how much he was spending on his elaborate office renovation, how often he used company funds for personal expenses, and how many corners he cut on business operations in order to maintain his expensive lifestyle. "I'll call you back, Morrison," Marcus said, ending his conversation and looking up at me with an expression that combined residual anger with obvious impatience. "What do you want, Sarah? I'm dealing with the mess you created this morning." "I have a document that requires your immediate attention," I said calmly, placing the sealed envelope on his desk. "It's time-sensitive and needs to be reviewed today." Marcus glanced at the envelope with mild irritation, probably assuming it was some routine paperwork related to one of his projects. "Can't this wait until later? I'm trying to salvage client relationships that you damaged with your inappropriate behavior this morning." "No," I replied simply. "This cannot wait." Something in my tone must have conveyed unusual seriousness, because Marcus picked up the envelope and examined it more carefully. When he saw the return address and my name, as property owner, his expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "What is this?" he asked, opening the envelope and unfolding the legal notice inside. I remained standing quietly while he read, watching his face transform as he processed the information. The confusion gave way to disbelief, then to shock, and finally to the kind of pale, wide-eyed terror that comes from suddenly understanding that your entire world has shifted beneath your feet. "This can't be right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're saying you own this building?" "I inherited it from my grandmother 3 years ago," I replied matter-of-factly. "The same week I started working here, actually. Quite a coincidence." Marcus stared at the notice, reading it again as if the words might change if he examined them more carefully. "Elena Rodriguez was your grandmother?" "She was. And she always said that property ownership was the foundation of real independence. Turns out she was right." The silence in Marcus's office was complete, except for the sound of traffic from the street below and the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus was clearly struggling to process the implications of what he had just learned, his face cycling through various expressions as he tried to understand how dramatically his situation had changed. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice taking on the pleading tone he typically used when trying to charm his way out of difficult situations. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about this morning. I was under tremendous pressure from the Morrison meeting, and I may have spoken more harshly than I intended." I let him continue his attempt at damage control, curious to see how he would try to reframe his behavior, now that he understood the actual balance of power between us. "Obviously, I value your contributions to the organization," he continued, his words coming faster as desperation crept into his voice. "The administrative support you provide is essential to our operations, and I've always recognized your dedication to the company's success." The revisionist history he was attempting to create would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetically transparent. Less than 2 hours ago, he had screamed at me in front of clients and colleagues, calling me worthless deadweight and suggesting I return to whatever trailer park had spawned me. Now he was trying to convince me that those words had been the result of temporary pressure, rather than his genuine assessment of my value and character. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I think it's important for you to understand that this morning's confrontation wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 3 years of systematic abuse, professional undermining, and personal attacks that I have documented extensively." His face went even paler as the implications of my words sank in. "Documented? Every instance of you taking credit for my work. Every occasion when you misrepresented my qualifications to clients. Every time you assigned me professional-level responsibilities while maintaining that I was just administrative support. Every conversation where you questioned my competence while relying on my expertise to manage your business operations." I paused to let him absorb this information before continuing. "Including your recent negotiations with what you thought was my grandmother's estate, where you attempted to pressure an elderly property manager into accepting below-market lease rates through intimidation and threats." Marcus's hands were visibly trembling as he held the eviction notice. "Sarah, please. We can work this out. I'm sure there's been miscommunication on both sides." "There's been no miscommunication," I replied. "You've been perfectly clear about your assessment of my worth and capabilities. This morning you called me worthless deadweight and suggested I return to a trailer park. Those weren't words spoken in anger, Marcus. They were your honest opinion about my value as a human being." He started to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. "The eviction notice gives you 30 days to vacate the premises," I continued. "I suggest you use that time to find new office space and to reflect on whether your treatment of employees might have contributed to this situation." Marcus's expression shifted again, this time toward the kind of desperate calculation that comes from recognizing that charm and manipulation aren't going to resolve a crisis. "You can't do this, Sarah. I have clients, employees, ongoing projects. This building is essential to my business operations. Your lease contained specific clauses about professional conduct and treatment of building occupants," I replied. "This morning's screaming episode violated those terms. The eviction is legal and final." "I'll fight this," he said, his voice rising again toward the anger that seemed to be his default response to situations he couldn't control. "I have lawyers, connections throughout this city. You can't destroy my business because of a personal grievance." For the first time since entering his office, I smiled. "Marcus, I'm not destroying your business. I'm simply declining to continue subsidizing it through below-market lease rates while you abuse the person who provides much of the actual value that your clients are paying for." The truth of that statement hit him like a physical blow. Peterson and Associates had been operating on artificially low overhead costs for years, and Marcus's profit margins were completely dependent on maintaining access to below-market office space. Relocating to comparable downtown property would increase his monthly costs by thousands of dollars, potentially making his business model unsustainable. More importantly, several of his most valuable client relationships were built on my direct interactions and problem-solving abilities. Without my coordination and management skills, Peterson and Associates would struggle to maintain the service quality that justified their premium pricing structure. "You need me," Marcus said desperately. "The Morrison project, the Riverside development, the downtown renovation, you coordinate all of that. Without you, those clients will go elsewhere." "Actually," I said calmly, "several of those clients have already indicated that they value working with me specifically. I imagine they'll be interested to know that I'm available for direct consultation now that I'm no longer employed as your administrative assistant." The implications of this statement clearly terrified Marcus more than the eviction notice itself. Losing his office space was a serious problem, but losing his most important clients would be catastrophic. "Sarah, please," he said, abandoning. all pretense of authority or negotiation. What do you want? Money? A promotion? A partnership in the company? We can work something out. I looked around his expensive office, taking in the meaningless awards, the pretentious furniture, and the photographs of Marcus posing with various local dignitaries who would probably distance themselves from him once word of this situation spread through Portland's business community. What I want, I said finally, is for you to experience exactly what you tried to make me experience this morning. Public humiliation, professional destruction, and the recognition that your assumptions about other people can have serious consequences. I turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. Oh, and Marcus? My grandmother bought this building with money she earned as a seamstress and house cleaner. She never lived in a trailer park, but she wouldn't have been ashamed if she had. The difference between you and her is that she built something real through hard work and integrity, while you've spent your career trying to acquire what other people created. As I left Marcus's office and walked back through the open workspace, toward my desk, I could feel the eyes of every colleague following my movement. Word was already spreading through the office that something significant had happened during my meeting with Marcus, though no one yet understood the full scope of what was unfolding. Jennifer Walsh approached me as I began gathering my personal belongings from my desk drawers. Sarah, what's going on? Marcus looks like he's seen a ghost. I gave my notice, I said simply, which was technically accurate, though far from complete. Your notice? Jennifer looked confused, but after this morning I thought he might. Fire me? I smiled at the irony. No, Jennifer. Marcus won't be firing anyone else from this office. Before she could ask for clarification, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael Torres, my property management attorney, returning the call I had placed to him during my walk from Marcus's office. Michael, I said, answering on the first ring. I've delivered the eviction notice. How did he take it? Michael asked, his voice reflecting the mixture of professional interest and personal concern that had characterized our relationship since I inherited my grandmother's properties. About as well as you'd expect, I replied. He's currently cycling through denial, bargaining, and rage. I expect he'll call his lawyers within the hour. Let him call. The eviction is legally sound, and the conduct violations are well documented. More importantly, his lease expires at the end of the year anyway, so we're simply accelerating a timeline that was already established. I could hear papers rustling in the background as Michael reviewed his files. I've already begun preliminary marketing for the space. Given the location and recent renovations, we should be able to secure a new tenant at market rates without difficulty. The financial implications of this transition were significant. Marcus had been paying approximately 60% of current market rates for his downtown office space, a legacy of the lease terms my grandmother had negotiated when the building was less desirable and Peterson and Associates was a smaller operation. A new tenant would likely pay nearly double what Marcus had been contributing, substantially increasing the property's revenue potential. But the financial benefits, while important, were secondary to the personal satisfaction of finally responding to Marcus's abuse with consequences that matched the severity of his behavior. For 3 years, he had systematically undermined my confidence, misrepresented my qualifications, and treated me as disposable support staff while relying on my professional expertise to maintain his business operations. This morning's confrontation had simply provided the final justification for actions I had been preparing to take for months. As I finished packing my personal belongings, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I had accepted a position as senior executive assistant at Peterson and Associates, believing it would provide valuable experience while I decided on my next career direction. I had never intended to remain in the role long term, but Marcus's systematic abuse had gradually eroded my confidence and made me question whether I was qualified for more challenging positions. What I hadn't understood at the time was that Marcus's treatment of me was motivated by his recognition of my capabilities, not by doubts about my competence. He had needed someone with professional-level skills to manage his increasingly complex business operations, but he had wanted to maintain control through intimidation and below-market compensation. The result had been a toxic dynamic that benefited him while systematically undermining my professional development and self-confidence. The irony was that while Marcus had been working to keep me dependent on his approval and grateful for his continued employment, I had been unknowingly accumulating the resources that would eventually make me completely independent of his organization. My inheritance from my grandmother had provided not just financial security, but also a different perspective on power dynamics and the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of other people's attempts at intimidation. Elena Rodriguez had faced discrimination and exploitation throughout her life, but she had never allowed other people's prejudices to define her possibilities or limit her ambitions. She had built real wealth through careful planning and hard work, and she had used that wealth to create independence for herself and opportunities for her family. This morning, Marcus Peterson had made the mistake of assuming that his temporary authority as my employer gave him the right to humiliate and dismiss someone whose background he knew nothing about and whose resources he had completely underestimated. In 30 days, he would discover just how serious that miscalculation had been. As I prepared to leave Peterson and Associates for the final time, I realized that my grandmother's letter had been prophetic in ways I was only beginning to understand. Property ownership hadn't just provided me with financial security. It had given me the kind of choices that made dignity possible and independence real. The woman who walked out of the Peterson and Associates offices that afternoon was fundamentally different from the one who had arrived that morning carrying Marcus's coffee and croissant. She was no longer someone who needed to tolerate abuse in exchange for employment security. She was someone who owned the ground beneath other people's feet and who had learned that respect isn't something you can demand from others. It's something you create for yourself through careful preparation and the courage to act when circumstances require decisive response. Marcus Peterson was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The news of my departure from Peterson and Associates spread through Portland's commercial real estate community with the kind of velocity that only truly shocking developments achieve. By Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after I had delivered the eviction notice to Marcus, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from former clients, industry contacts, and business associates who had heard various versions of what had transpired in the Peterson and Associates conference room. The first call came from David Morrison himself, who had apparently spent considerable time reflecting on Tuesday morning's confrontation and had reached some disturbing conclusions about the dynamics he had witnessed. His voice carried a mixture of concern and professional curiosity when I answered his call Wednesday evening from my apartment overlooking the Willamette River. "Sarah," he began without preamble, "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday morning, and I'm deeply troubled by what I observed. More than that, I'm concerned about the implications for the Morrison project, and frankly, for any future business relationship with Peterson and Associates." I had been expecting this conversation, though perhaps not quite so soon. Morrison was known throughout Portland's development community for his ethical business practices and his intolerance for unprofessional conduct. The spectacle he had witnessed in Marcus's conference room would have violated every standard of workplace behavior that Morrison valued in his own organization. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, mindful that while I was no longer employed by Peterson and Associates, there were still legal and professional considerations that required discretion in how I discussed the situation. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly," Morrison continued. "Was what I witnessed yesterday representative of the normal working environment at Peterson and Associates? Because if it was, I cannot in good conscience continue doing business with an organization that treats its employees that way." The question was both simple and extraordinarily complex. Morrison was asking me to characterize 3 years of systematic workplace abuse while avoiding any statements that could be construed as defamatory or legally problematic. More importantly, he was asking me to help him make a decision that could have significant financial implications for Peterson and Associates and its remaining employees. What you witnessed was not an isolated incident, I said finally. It was representative of a pattern of behavior that had been developing for quite some time. Morrison was quiet for several moments, apparently processing the implications of my response. I see. And your decision to leave Peterson and Associates was related to this pattern of behavior? My decision to leave was based on a recognition that certain working environments are incompatible with professional growth and personal dignity, I replied. Sometimes it takes time to understand when tolerance becomes complicity in your own mistreatment. Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you, Morrison said, his tone shifting to the kind of straightforward business discussion that had made him successful in complex development projects. The Morrison project is currently scheduled to continue for another 14 months. The coordination and management work you've been providing has been exceptional, and frankly, I'm not confident that Peterson and Associates can maintain that level of service without your involvement. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. I'm considering terminating our contract with Peterson and Associates and engaging directly with an independent project management consultant. Would you be interested in discussing that possibility? The offer was both flattering and strategically significant. Morrison represented one of Peterson and Associates' most valuable client relationships, and losing that account would create serious financial difficulties for Marcus's already struggling business. More importantly, Morrison's decision to work with me directly would likely influence other clients who had developed confidence in my coordination abilities during their projects with Peterson and Associates. I would be very interested in discussing that possibility, I replied. I should mention that I'm no longer constrained by any non-compete agreements with Peterson and Associates, so there wouldn't be any legal complications with a direct consulting arrangement. Excellent. Can you meet with me Friday morning to discuss the details? I'd like to move quickly on this transition. After ending the call with Morrison, I sat on my apartment balcony overlooking the river and reflected on how rapidly my professional situation was evolving. Wednesday morning, I had been an abused administrative assistant with no apparent alternatives to continued tolerance of Marcus's behavior. By Wednesday evening, I was a property owner with growing opportunities for independent consulting work, with clients who valued my expertise. The transformation wasn't magical or overnight, despite how it might appear to outside observers. It was the result of 3 years of careful preparation, systematic documentation, and gradual relationship building that had finally reached a point where decisive action became both possible and necessary. Marcus's explosive confrontation had simply provided the catalyst that accelerated a transition I had been preparing for months. Thursday morning brought a different kind of call, this one from Jennifer Walsh at Peterson and Associates. Her voice carried the strained quality of someone who was trying to maintain professional composure while dealing with an increasingly chaotic workplace situation. Sarah, I probably shouldn't be calling you, Jennifer began, but things here are completely falling apart, and I thought you should know what's happening. I had expected that Marcus would be struggling to manage the operational disruption caused by my sudden departure, but Jennifer's description of the situation was more severe than I had anticipated. Apparently, Marcus had spent most of Wednesday attempting to contact clients to reassure them about continuity of service, only to discover that several of them were already questioning their relationships with Peterson and Associates based on reports of Tuesday morning's confrontation. 3 clients called yesterday asking to speak with you specifically, Jennifer continued. When Marcus told them you were no longer with the company, 2 of them asked for immediate meetings to discuss their projects. The Riverside development people want to review their entire contract, and the downtown renovation client is talking about bringing in their own project coordinator. The ripple effects of Marcus's behavior were spreading faster than either of us had anticipated. In the commercial real estate industry, professional relationships are built on trust and competence, and word travels quickly when either of those qualities is questioned. Marcus's public abuse of an employee who had direct, Client relationships had created exactly the kind of reputation damage that could permanently affect his business prospects. "How is Marcus handling the situation?" I asked, though I suspected I could guess the answer. "He's in complete panic mode," Jennifer replied. "Yesterday, he called an emergency staff meeting and announced that anyone discussing Tuesday's incident with outside parties would be terminated immediately. Then he spent 2 hours reviewing every project file trying to figure out what you actually do, because apparently he doesn't really know the details of how anything gets coordinated." This revelation, while not entirely surprising, highlighted one of the fundamental problems with Marcus's management approach. He had been so focused on maintaining authority and taking credit for successful outcomes that he had never bothered to understand the actual work processes that produced those outcomes. My departure had created an immediate operational crisis because no one else in the organization fully understood the client relationships and coordination systems I had developed. "Jennifer, I need to ask you something," I said carefully. "Are you and the other employees being pressured to take on additional responsibilities without appropriate compensation or support?" "Sarah, Marcus is asking me to manage the Morrison project coordination starting Monday. I'm an accounting manager. I've never done project coordination, and I don't have relationships with any of the contractors or suppliers. But Marcus says, it's just a matter of following the systems you established." The absurdity of this approach was both predictable and troubling. Marcus was attempting to address a professional crisis by reassigning complex responsibilities to employees who lacked the necessary experience and training. The result would likely be service failures that could damage client relationships even further, while creating impossible working conditions for the remaining staff. "Jennifer, I can't give you professional advice about your employment situation," I said, "but I would encourage you to document any new responsibilities you're asked to assume, particularly if they're outside your area of expertise. And if you're asked to communicate directly with clients about projects you're not familiar with, you might want to ensure that those instructions are provided in writing." After ending the call with Jennifer, I realized that Marcus's crisis was accelerating beyond what even I had anticipated. The eviction notice had given him 30 days to find new office space, but the client defections and operational disruptions were creating more immediate pressures that could threaten the viability of his business long before the lease termination became effective. Friday morning's meeting with Morrison confirmed that the situation was indeed developing into a broader industry conversation about professional standards and workplace conduct. Morrison's conference room included not just his usual project team, but also representatives from 2 other major development firms who were apparently interested in discussing similar consulting arrangements. "Sarah," Morrison began after introductions were completed, "word is spreading through the development community about what happened at Peterson and Associates. Several of us have had concerns about Marcus Peterson's business practices for some time, but Tuesday's incident has prompted more serious discussions about professional standards in our industry." One of the other developers, Catherine Williams from Cascade Development Group, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Sarah, we've been following your work on several projects over the past 2 years. Frankly, we always assumed you were Peterson's project manager rather than administrative support. Your level of expertise and client communication has been consistently impressive." The meeting evolved into a comprehensive discussion about independent project management consulting and the possibility of establishing a collaborative practice that could serve multiple development firms simultaneously. The financial potential was substantial, but more importantly, the conversation represented recognition of my professional capabilities that had been systematically undermined during my 3 years at Peterson and Associates. "What we're proposing," Morrison explained, "is essentially a boutique consulting practice that provides project coordination services to development firms that prefer to work with independent specialists rather than maintaining large internal project management departments." Catherine Williams nodded in agreement. "The overhead advantages are significant, and the quality control benefits are even more important. Working with someone who has proven expertise and established relationships throughout the contractor and supplier community eliminates many of the coordination problems that can derail complex projects. By the end of the meeting, I had preliminary agreements for consulting work that would generate more revenue in 6 months than I had earned in 3 years as Marcus's senior executive assistant. More importantly, I would be working directly with clients who valued my expertise rather than trying to perform professional-level work while being characterized as administrative support. As I drove back to my apartment Friday afternoon, I reflected on the broader implications of what was unfolding. Marcus's attempt to publicly humiliate me had triggered a series of consequences that he clearly hadn't anticipated. His assumption that I was powerless and dependent on his continued employment had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of both my resources and my professional relationships. The weekend brought additional developments that further complicated Marcus's situation. Michael Torres called Saturday morning with news that Peterson and Associates attorneys had contacted his office attempting to negotiate a modification of the eviction timeline. "They're requesting a 60-day extension of the lease termination," Michael explained. "Apparently, Peterson is having difficulty finding suitable alternative space within his budget constraints." This wasn't surprising given the financial realities of Portland's commercial real estate market. Marcus had been paying below-market rates for premium downtown office space, and comparable properties were leasing for substantially higher amounts. More problematically, his recent client defections were reducing his revenue, while his space requirement search was increasing his immediate expenses. "They're also requesting a meeting to discuss possible lease renewal terms," Michael continued. "The language suggests they're prepared to negotiate significantly higher rental rates if we're willing to extend the tenancy." The irony of this development was profound. For months, Marcus had been demanding below-market lease rates while threatening to relocate Peterson and Associates if his terms weren't accepted. He had assumed that my grandmother's estate would be motivated primarily by security rather than revenue maximization. Now, facing the reality of his actual alternatives, he was prepared to pay market rates for the space he had previously demanded, at discount pricing. "What's your recommendation?" I asked, though I had already formed my own opinion about the appropriate response. "From a purely financial perspective, accepting a lease renewal at market rates would be advantageous," Michael Dean replied. "However, given the documented conduct violations and the ongoing workplace culture problems, I would recommend against extending the tenancy. The building's reputation could be damaged by continued association with Peterson's business practices." Sunday brought the most significant development yet. Morrison called to inform me that he had officially terminated Peterson and Associates' contract for the Morrison project and had engaged my new consulting practice to complete the remaining coordination work. More importantly, he had discussed the situation with several other developers who were considering similar transitions. "Sarah, I want you to know that this decision isn't just about Tuesday's confrontation," Morrison explained. "Over the past few months, several of us have been comparing notes about our experiences with Peterson and Associates, and we've identified patterns of behavior that are inconsistent with the professional standards we expect from our business partners." He paused, and I could hear traffic sounds in the background suggesting he was calling from his car. "The way Marcus treated you was unacceptable, but it was also revealing about his character and judgment. Someone who abuses employees and misrepresents their qualifications to clients is not someone we can trust with multi-million-dollar development projects." By Sunday evening, the financial implications of the past week's events were becoming clear. Peterson and Associates had lost at least 3 major client relationships, including the Morrison project, which represented approximately 20% of their annual revenue. The remaining clients were requesting meetings to review their project, coordination arrangements, and several had already expressed interest in working directly with my new consulting practice. Meanwhile, Marcus was facing the dual pressures of declining revenue and increasing operational costs. The eviction notice required him to find new office space within 30 days, but comparable downtown properties were leasing for rates that would substantially increase his overhead costs. The client defections meant that his cash flow was declining precisely when he needed additional resources to manage the business relocation. Most importantly, the industry conversation about professional standards and workplace conduct was beginning to affect his broader reputation within Portland's development community. Commercial real estate is a relationship-driven industry where professional credibility is essential for long-term success. Marcus's public abuse of an employee who had direct client relationships had created exactly the kind of reputation damage that could have lasting effects on his business prospects. Monday morning brought confirmation that the situation had evolved beyond a simple employment dispute into a comprehensive business crisis for Peterson and Associates. Jennifer Walsh called, again, this time with news that 3 additional employees had submitted resignation notices over the weekend. "Sarah, it's complete chaos here," Jennifer reported. "Marcus called an emergency meeting this morning and basically accused everyone of conspiring against him. He said that anyone who wasn't completely loyal to the company should leave immediately, and apparently several people took him up on that offer." The staff departures were creating additional operational problems for Peterson and Associates at precisely the time when Marcus needed maximum stability to manage the client transitions and office relocation. The remaining employees were being asked to assume responsibilities they weren't trained for while dealing with an increasingly unstable work environment. "How are you holding up?" I asked Jennifer, genuinely concerned about the people who were still trying to maintain professional standards while working for someone who was clearly in crisis. "I'm updating my resume," Jennifer replied honestly. This morning, Marcus screamed at our receptionist for 10 minutes because she couldn't answer detailed questions about a construction project she's never been involved with. "I can't work in this environment anymore." Tuesday brought the most dramatic development yet. Michael Torres called with news that Peterson and Associates' attorneys had submitted a formal complaint alleging that the eviction was retaliatory and motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate lease violations. "They're claiming that your employment dispute with Peterson is unrelated to your role as property owner," Michael explained, "and that using the eviction process to resolve workplace conflicts constitutes abuse of landlord authority." The legal strategy was both predictable and fundamentally flawed. Marcus's attorneys were attempting to separate my role as employee from my role as property owner, arguing that the eviction was motivated by personal retaliation rather than legitimate business concerns. However, the documented conduct violations and lease term breaches provided clear legal justification for the termination notice. "How strong is their case?" I asked, though I suspected Michael's analysis would confirm my own assessment. "Their argument has some theoretical merit," Michael replied, "but the practical evidence is overwhelmingly in our favor. The conduct violations are well documented, the lease terms are clear, and the termination process has followed proper legal procedures. More importantly, Peterson's business practices have created additional violations since the original notice was served." He was referring to Marcus's threats against employees who discussed the situation with outside parties, his attempts to pressure remaining staff into accepting responsibilities beyond their qualifications, and his increasingly erratic behavior that was affecting other tenants in the building. "I recommend that we respond by documenting additional lease violations that have occurred since the original termination notice," Michael continued. "Peterson's conduct over the past week has provided ample evidence that the termination was not only justified, but necessary to protect the building's professional environment." Wednesday brought news that confirmed the broader industry impact of the Peterson and Associates situation. Catherine Williams called to inform me that the Portland Commercial Real Estate Association was planning to include workplace conduct standards in their upcoming professional development seminar series. "Sarah, your situation has sparked conversations throughout the industry about professional standards and employee treatment," Catherine explained. "Several association members have shared similar experiences with problematic workplace environments. And there's growing recognition that we need to address these issues more systematically. The development represented validation that the problems at Peterson and Associates weren't isolated incidents, but part of broader patterns that needed industry attention. More importantly, it suggested that Marcus's reputation damage might extend beyond immediate client relationships to affect his standing within the professional community that was essential for his long-term business success. Thursday brought the most significant financial development yet. Morrison called to inform me that 2 additional major developers had decided to terminate their relationships with Peterson and Associates and engage my consulting practice for their ongoing projects. "Sarah, the consulting model you're developing is exactly what our industry needs," Morrison explained. "Independent specialists who can provide expertise without the overhead and management complications of traditional full-service firms." The financial implications were substantial. In less than 2 weeks, I had transitioned from earning an administrative assistant's salary to establishing a consulting practice with revenue potential that exceeded my previous annual compensation by several multiples. More importantly, I was working directly with clients who valued my expertise, rather than trying to perform professional work while being systematically undermined by an abusive supervisor. Friday brought the final confirmation that Marcus's world had fundamentally changed. Michael Torres called with news that Peterson and Associates had officially withdrawn their complaint against the eviction and had submitted a formal request for lease termination assistance. "They're asking for our help in finding alternative office space," Michael reported with obvious irony. Apparently, their search for suitable downtown property has been unsuccessful, and they're concerned about maintaining business continuity during the transition. The request represented complete capitulation from Marcus's earlier threats and demands. Having discovered that his leverage was illusory and his alternatives were limited, he was now seeking assistance from the same property owner he had attempted to intimidate and manipulate for months. "What's our response?" I asked, though I already knew what my grandmother would have advised. "Professional courtesy requires that we provide reasonable assistance with the transition," Michael replied. "However, we're under no obligation to extend the termination timeline or provide below-market alternatives to accommodate his financial constraints." That evening, as I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset over the Willamette River, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in just 2 weeks. Marcus Peterson's attempt to publicly humiliate me had triggered a series of consequences that had fundamentally altered both his business prospects and my career trajectory. The man who had called me worthless deadweight and suggested I return to a trailer park was now requesting assistance from the woman who owned the building that housed his failing business. The employee who had been characterized as incompetent administrative support was now running an independent consulting practice, with more revenue potential than Peterson and Associates itself. But beyond the personal satisfaction of seeing Marcus's assumptions proven wrong, the situation had provided broader lessons about power dynamics, professional relationships, and the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of other people's attempts at intimidation. My grandmother had been right about property ownership providing choices and independence, but she had also been right about something more fundamental. Respect isn't something you can demand from others through intimidation or manipulation. It's something you earn through competence, integrity, and the courage to stand up for your principles when circumstances require decisive action. Marcus Peterson had spent 3 years trying to control me through systematic abuse and professional undermining. What he never understood was that real power doesn't come from the ability to humiliate others. It comes from building something valuable and maintaining the strength to protect it when necessary. In 30 days, Peterson and Associates would vacate the building that had housed their operations for 5 years. Marcus would relocate to smaller, more expensive office space that reflected his actual financial position rather than the artificial advantages he had enjoyed through below-market lease rates. Most importantly, he would discover that the professional Relationships and industry standing he had taken for granted could be lost just as quickly as they had been built, especially when they were based on other people's work rather than his own authentic contributions. The woman who had inherited a seamstress's real estate portfolio had learned to use that inheritance not just for financial security, but as a foundation for building authentic professional success based on competence rather than accommodation. And Marcus Peterson had learned that underestimating people based on their apparent position rather than their actual capabilities was the kind of mistake that could destroy everything he thought he had built. The final day of Marcus Peterson's tenancy arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that makes Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. I stood at the windows of my new consulting office on the 12th floor, watching the moving trucks positioned outside the Peterson and Associates building that I now simply called my building. The irony wasn't lost on me that my new office space, located just 3 blocks away, offered a perfect view of Marcus's forced departure from the premises he had once controlled so completely. The past month had been a masterclass in how quickly professional dominance could transform into professional devastation when built on intimidation rather than authentic value creation. Peterson and Associates, which had once occupied the entire 14th floor with grandiose displays of success, was now relocating to a cramped 3rd-floor suite in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of downtown. The new space cost 40% more than their previous lease, while offering less than half the square footage and none of the prestigious address advantages that Marcus had leveraged for years in his client presentations. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh, who had become one of my first consulting associates after finally submitting her resignation from Peterson and Associates 2 weeks earlier. "Moving day drama," she wrote, accompanied by a photo of Marcus directing the movers with the kind of frantic energy that suggested he was still struggling to accept his reduced circumstances. "He's demanding they handle his awards collection with museum-quality care." The movers looked confused about why anyone would be so concerned about participation trophies. Jennifer's transition to my consulting practice had been seamless, her accounting expertise proving invaluable as we structured project management services for multiple development firms simultaneously. Her insider knowledge of Peterson and Associates' operational weaknesses had also been instrumental in ensuring that our client transitions were handled with the kind of professional competence that Marcus had never been able to provide. The morning's first client meeting brought Morrison and his entire project team to review the final phases of what had once been Peterson and Associates' signature development. The Morrison project was now 6 weeks ahead of schedule and substantially under budget, primarily due to the elimination of the communication inefficiencies and artificial complications that had characterized Marcus's management approach. "Sarah," Morrison said as we concluded our review, "I've been thinking about our conversation 6 months ago when you first suggested streamlining the contractor coordination protocols. Marcus dismissed your recommendations as overcomplicating simple processes. Now that we've implemented those same protocols, we're seeing exactly the time and cost savings you predicted." The observation highlighted one of the most satisfying aspects of my new professional independence. Ideas that Marcus had rejected or claimed credit for were now being implemented directly, allowing their actual value to become visible without the distortion of his ego and control issues. My consulting practice was building a reputation for innovative problem-solving precisely because I was finally free to apply my expertise without having to navigate someone else's insecurities. Catherine Williams arrived for our noon strategy session with news that confirmed the broader industry transformation that had been accelerating since Marcus's public meltdown. "The Commercial Real Estate Association has approved the Workplace Standards Initiative," she reported, settling into the conference room chair with obvious satisfaction. "Your situation became the catalyst for conversations that were long overdue in this industry." The association's new guidelines addressed everything from professional communication standards to employee recognition protocols, essentially codifying the kinds of basic respect that should have been automatic in any functional workplace. More importantly, The guidelines included reporting mechanisms for documenting violations and consequences for firms that failed to maintain appropriate professional environments. Several other firms have already indicated they'll be adopting similar independent consulting models, Catherine continued. The overhead advantages are substantial, but the quality control benefits are even more significant. Marcus's approach of taking credit for other people's work while undermining their confidence appears to be more common than any of us realized. The afternoon brought the day's most dramatic moment when my building's security system alerted me that Marcus himself was requesting access to the 14th floor. According to the security log, he claimed to have forgotten several important items in his former office and was seeking permission for one final retrieval visit. I granted the access request, curious about what Marcus might consider important, enough to risk another encounter with the woman whose capabilities he had so catastrophically underestimated. 20 minutes later, I received a call from Frank, the building's security guard, reporting that Marcus was standing in his empty former office, apparently struggling to accept the reality of his circumstances. "He's just staring at the walls," Frank reported quietly. "Been up there for 15 minutes without moving. You want me to check on him?" I decided to handle the situation personally, taking the elevator to the 14th floor where I found Marcus standing in the center of what had once been his prestigious corner office. The space looked smaller without his expensive furniture and pretentious wall displays. Just another empty office suite waiting for a new tenant who would hopefully bring more authentic professional competence to the space. "Sarah," Marcus said, without turning around when he heard my footsteps. His voice carried none of the authority or intimidation that had once characterized our interactions. I keep thinking there must have been some other way this could have worked out. I remained near the doorway, maintaining physical distance while observing the man who had spent 3 years systematically undermining my confidence and professional development. Without his expensive suits and carefully managed authority displays, Marcus looked exactly like what he had always been, someone whose success had been built on other people's work rather than his own authentic capabilities. "There were many opportunities for different outcomes," I replied calmly. "Every day for 3 years, you had chances to treat people with basic professional respect. Every client interaction where you took credit for my work was a choice. Every time you questioned my competence while relying on my expertise was a decision about the kind of leader you wanted to be." Marcus finally turned to face me, his expression cycling through emotions I couldn't quite identify. "I never intended for things to become so complicated. The business pressures, the client demands, the financial stress. Sometimes people say things they don't really mean." The attempted explanation was both predictable and inadequate. Marcus was trying to reframe 3 years of systematic abuse as temporary lapses in judgment caused by external pressures, rather than acknowledging the fundamental character issues that had created those patterns. Even now, faced with the complete collapse of his professional standing, he was struggling to accept responsibility for his own choices. "Marcus," I said quietly, "the morning you called me worthless deadweight and suggested I return to a trailer park, you weren't responding to temporary pressure. You were revealing what you actually thought about people you perceived as beneath your social status. That kind of contempt doesn't develop overnight, and it doesn't disappear just because the consequences become uncomfortable." The silence that followed my words was complete, except for the sound of traffic from the street below and the gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus stared at me for several moments, apparently searching for some response that might restore even a fragment of his former authority. "The new office space is smaller than I had hoped," he said finally, as if sharing a confidence that might generate sympathy. "The overhead costs are going to be challenging, especially with the client transitions we've experienced recently." I found myself genuinely curious about his perspective on the situation he had created. "Marcus, do you understand why your clients chose to work with my consulting practice rather than continuing their relationships with Peterson and Associates?" His face flushed slightly, suggesting that the question touched on painful realities he was still struggling to process. "I assume they were influenced by the personal relationships you developed while working as my assistant." The characterization was both accurate and completely inadequate. My relationships with those clients had indeed been personal, built through months of competent service and reliable problem-solving. But Marcus still couldn't acknowledge that those relationships existed because I had provided genuine value, not because I had somehow manipulated professional contacts for personal advantage. Those clients valued working with someone who understood their projects, anticipated problems, and delivered solutions without drama or ego complications, I replied. They didn't leave Peterson and Associates because of personal loyalty to me. They left because they experienced better service quality and professional competence through direct consultation. Marcus nodded slowly, finally beginning to understand that his crisis wasn't the result of personal betrayal or unfair competition. It was the natural consequence of clients choosing competence over manipulation, authentic value over artificial authority. As he prepared to leave the empty office for the final time, Marcus paused near the doorway where I was standing. "Sarah, I hope you understand that I never intended to hurt anyone. Sometimes business leadership requires difficult decisions that aren't always popular with everyone involved." The final attempt at self-justification was almost breathtaking in its disconnect from reality. Even now, Marcus was characterizing his systematic abuse as unpopular leadership decisions rather than acknowledging the fundamental inappropriateness of his behavior. "Marcus," I said, offering him the same professional courtesy I would extend to any departing tenant, "I hope your new office space provides opportunities for the kind of reflection that leads to genuine personal growth." Watching Marcus leave the building that afternoon, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from his humiliated assistant to his former landlord. The transformation hadn't been magical or overnight, despite how it might appear to casual observers. It had been the result of careful preparation, systematic documentation, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances demanded authentic self-advocacy. My grandmother's legacy had provided more than financial security. It had taught me that real power comes from building something valuable and maintaining the strength to protect it when necessary. Marcus Peterson had spent 3 years trying to control me through intimidation and manipulation, never understanding that authentic influence is earned through competence and integrity rather than demanded through fear and domination. The consulting practice I had built was thriving not because I had inherited money or taken advantage of personal connections, but because I provided genuine professional value to clients who appreciated competent service. The difference between my approach and Marcus's was fundamental. I built relationships through performance, while he had tried to maintain control through psychological manipulation. 6 months later, I received a Christmas card from Marcus at his new office address. The message was brief and professionally neutral, wishing me success in my consulting practice and expressing hope that Portland's development community would continue to thrive. There was no acknowledgement of past behavior, no apology for 3 years of systematic abuse, but also no attempt to relitigate the circumstances that had led to his professional downfall. I filed the card with other professional correspondents, recognizing it as confirmation that Marcus had finally accepted the new reality where I was his equal in the business community rather than his subordinate employee. The woman he had once dismissed as worthless deadweight was now a respected consultant whose expertise was valued by the same clients he was struggling to attract to his diminished practice. My grandmother had been right about property ownership, providing choices and independence, but she had also understood something more profound about the relationship between respect and power. True strength isn't found in the ability to humiliate others, but in building something meaningful that can't be taken away by people who mistake temporary authority for permanent superiority. Marcus Peterson had learned that lesson in the most expensive way possible, losing his business, his reputation, and his illusions about the source of his professional success. The building he had once commanded now housed a thriving consulting practice, run by the woman whose capabilities he had systematically underestimated, and every morning when I arrived at my office, I was reminded that dignity and professional success are built through competence and integrity rather than accommodation and fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.